Hi, this is Dennis Sanders, and welcome to this YouTube version of En route, the podcast about notes along the way. I'm trying to start doing some podcasts on YouTube, and it probably helps if you actually see a little bit of video where I'm actually talking instead of just seeing a static image. The rest of this podcast will be a static image, but I wanted to at least say hello. Um, I hope you will watch this video. Tell me what you think about it. Um, it's not an important issue. It's how do we restore the fabric of American society? I tend to believe that we are headed towards what seems to be to use the German word, Wiederaufbau, which means collapse. And so the title of this episode is actually Wiederaufbau, which is the word for reconstruction. And so I'm trying to figure out how we can do that, and I offer 4 ways that we can. So I hope you enjoy this episode of En route. See ya. Hello, and welcome to En route, the podcast where we talk about life on the way. I'm Dennis Sanders, and I'm your host. Make sure to visit our website, enroutepodcast.org, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or via RSS so that you'll never miss a show. And while you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate it if you would rate us on iTunes or simply tell a friend about the show. That would help us out too. So a few episodes ago, I talked about America facing a Götterdämmerung. A Götterdämmerung is the collapse of our society. And America is broken in so many ways. And I know we use the word broken so much in our parlance today, but I think when it comes to our nation, it's true. America is broken. Our social safety net is broken. We are more atomized than ever. We're divided by race and class, and we can't even seem to come together to build infrastructure, let alone tackle a once-in-a-century pandemic. In the latest issue of The Atlantic, writer George Packer talks about how America is actually divided into 4 separate Americas. He talks about Free America, and that's basically the Reagan coalition that was interested more in shrinking government as well as shrinking and loosening other social ties. There's Smart America, a place that is based on the meritocracy and tends to look down on people not like them, especially the working class. There's Real America, which is basically made up of just the white working class. It's suspicious of elites and anyone that's not white. And finally, there is Just America. It's an America that seems to focus on America being a less than perfect society. In fact, to say that it is a very imperfect society and has very little to say on how to fix societal problems, much less why they should be fixed. Each one of these Americas has ripped apart the social fabric, and none have done anything really to try to weave us back together because frankly they're too siloed off from each other to care. So if Götterdämmerung is about collapse, then Wiederaufbau is about reconstruction or rebuilding. Now, this German word has been associated with Germany in the post-war years as the nation sought to rebuild in the aftermath of World War II. But the rebuilding wasn't simply about rebuilding physical buildings. Even though that was true, most of the major cities were bombed out, and you had to restructure and build those cities and industry back up. But they also needed to build up something else, and that was to build up the society, the spirit of German society. 4 years ago, in 2017, my husband and I went to Germany. We spent some time in Frankfurt and then also in Stuttgart. And what is so fascinating, and this is not my first time to Europe, but what was so fascinating and what made this trip so different from other European vacations is how much World War II was still a living thing in Germany. Everywhere you went, they would talk about how this part of the city, this building, had been destroyed in the war and was rebuilt after. And that was the case with so many places in Germany. In Frankfurt, there is a place that we visited called Paulskirche, or St. Paul's Church. Now, it's no longer an active church, but it's well known and famous really for one major reason. Because 150 years prior, in 1848, the kind of first stirrings of what would be German democracy took place there. 1848, for those of you who don't know, was a year of sweeping revolutions throughout Europe that challenged the old order, and that in most cases was the aristocracy, and really wanted to move and support liberalism. And it was here in Frankfurt that a parliament in what was at that time Prussia was put together. And it met during kind of the liberal spring that was there. And it met at Paulskirche. And so when we go back to just after the war, and remember, Germany is broken. They have been defeated in war. The Allies have bombed their cities. They have surrendered. As they were rebuilding Frankfurt, the mayor, and I believe, and also the people of Frankfurt, wanted Paulskirche to be built first, before anything else, even their own homes. They rebuilt Paulskirche because of what it stood for. It stood for democracy. And after spending decades in a broken society, broken in the aftermath of World War I, broken during the Weimar Republic, broken especially during the Third Reich, they wanted something that was a symbol of hope. And so they wanted Paulskirche to be rebuilt first. It was a way of rededicating themselves to democratic rule. And after living, as I said, for so many years in this broken society, they wanted a living symbol of Wiederaufbau. America is not Nazi Germany, so I need to stress that before anyone starts to think I'm saying that this is Nazi Germany. We're not even post-war Germany. But something about us, something about our society is broken. We are torn apart. And the thing is, how do we put ourselves back together? There aren't any easy answers, but I came up with 4 suggestions. And look, I'm not anyone special, but I am an American, and I am concerned about what I see in our society. So this is my attempt to try to put some things together that might help bring our country back together. So here are the 4 things. The first is that we need to rebuild civility. This is controversial because these days it is really hard to talk about civility without people misunderstanding what we're talking about. It's become so common in our society today to think of civility as nothing more than a tool of oppression or a way of shutting people up. Or it's about being nice. And especially these days, no one wants to be nice. But civility isn't trying to be nice. It's not trying to oppress. It's not trying to obfuscate issues. Civility really is treating those that we disagree with as human beings that are worthy of respect instead of people who are evil that must be taken out. If you look at Fox News, if you look at MSNBC, the thing that I don't like about either of those channels and why I think they do great harm in our society is because, well, one, the news that happens on those channels are highly suspect, but they're more interested about riling up their side more than anything else. What they're interested in is really talking about how the other side is bad and how they're evil. And so that's kind of their main goal, is to do that. And of course, it works. You get people who come and they watch because it reaffirms what they already know. And I think that those things like that have helped to drive down civility. But it's not simply just television. And, these days everyone wants to blame social media. We will talk about all algorithms and how they are designed towards conflict, and that's what has made us so uncivil. But the fact is, we have had a problem with civility long before Twitter or Facebook came on the scene. It doesn't mean that those two are blameless, but they simply accelerated what was already there. We have to find ways for our institutions to be able to be places where discussion is fostered, but also where respect is fostered. Somewhere in our life we have learned not to respect other people who are different from us, whether it's that they have a different opinion or are just different. We don't know how to do that. And we need to have places where we can learn civility. Maybe it's not too far off to say that it's, the word civility and the other word civic are very much related. That civility has a public function. It's not about simply being nice, but it is about bringing together as a society. Because if you don't have a society that is knitted together in some way, it doesn't mean universal agreement. But if you don't have something where people can see each other with respect, that makes democracy difficult to maintain. I think the second thing that we need to do is to bring back the common good. Now, I'm on the center right, and somewhere at some point we don't like to hear the word common good. That has scared us because we tend to think that anything that talks about common good is some kind of communist plot. However, and also though I do need to add this important caveat, there have been people on the right that are bringing up the common good. But mostly those people are people who have maybe seen the movement of Donald Trump and saw it as a way to bring back their own kind of sense of what they think how society should run. There are people like the Catholic integralists, led by people like Patrick Deneen and Adrian Vermeule, who talk about common good, but common good there is not about looking beyond your own interest towards the interest of others. It's really a sense of conformity. It's really a sense of everyone should think the same way, everyone should do things the same way. And that's not what the common good should be about. The common good should be about looking at the wider picture, not just looking at our own picture. And maybe the best way that I can put this to an example is to talk about Penn Station in New York. If you have ever been to New York, and you've ever been through Penn Station, you know what it looks like. Now, Penn Station years ago, at the turn of the last century, a building was built. It was a very beautiful building for the main station in the city. Unfortunately, that building was torn down in the 1960s, and in its place was built a station that was built underground. And it was not much to look at. You get off the train, and it's kind of dingy. It feels like you stepped into 1976 in New York. And I don't mean that in a good way. And so there have been over the years a move to rebuild and repair and help Penn Station have a new look. And there is an article I will put in the show notes that tells you a little bit about that process, but also it begins with an interesting story that in some ways talks about and sums up America right now. But they wanted to build a train hall that was kind of almost like a terminal where people can come in, they would get ticketing, and then have stairs that would go to the train. It took nearly 30 years for that to get built. To understand why it took so long, you have to go back to the 1970s. And there were great efforts through government to really make sure that when big infrastructure projects were being built, that people's voices were being heard. Because there were people like Robert Moses, the great who's been called the master builder. He built a lot of public works projects. He would build projects, and they were beautiful projects, but they always came at a cost in some ways, because they would sometimes build over people's houses and neighborhoods, and all those places were literally plowed under for his projects to be built. Add in how many freeways that were built into cities usually were built over African American neighborhoods. That is something I've talked about here in Minnesota. A black neighborhood in St. Paul, Rondo, was basically destroyed to put in Interstate 94. So there were, people's hearts were in the right places. They wanted to make sure that these projects were built with some sense of care. But as it always happens, what was intended was not how it turned out. Different groups with different interests now were able, because of the changes, to come in to block the process. There was no sense in making sure voices were heard. It was simply to block things. And Penn Station was just one example. In fact, they wanted to use the main post office, which was built by the next door to what was the old Penn Station, to use it, most of it, for the train hall. And for many years, the Postal Service blocked it. And there were other interests that blocked it as well. And This story was not simply just about what now is the Moynihan Train Hall, which just finally opened up this year. It was basically a stand-in for other projects because, and I found this interesting, in New York City alone, since the 1960s, there had not been any major public works project built. So for nearly over 50 years, nothing had been built. And when they were built, and there were some built, it was because of basically 9/11. You had to have a bunch of terrorists to basically have a public works project. And that is the problem all around the country, that we aren't able to build the projects that we used to build because these laws that were built, that were designed to make sure that people were able to at least have their voices heard, to make sure that we didn't run roughshod, became ways of blocking any type of project. And it's an example that we were all divided into our own interests. We weren't really thinking about the wider goal. So everyone was thinking in their own interest, but not in a wider interest, whether that's a city interest or a nation interest. The thing is, though, you can believe in your own interest, but also see something wider than you. You can look about how your self-interest is tied into the self-interest of someone else. But to do that, we have to have a wider scope. And I think a problem in our America today is that we can't really see beyond our own view. So the third thing that we need is to rebuild bipartisanship. Now, we always talk about that it would be nice if we were more bipartisan, and that if we do this and that, maybe in Congress sit with one another, we can restore bipartisanship. But bipartisanship isn't about being nice to one another. It's really about creating those spaces, those structures that allow for bipartisanship to happen. The reason in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s there was more bipartisanship than there has been in recent years is because there were certain things that happened and certain structures that made it possible. Obviously, the most obvious one is is World War II. Many of the people who came in and to serve in Congress after World War II were people who served in the army or in the military. So they all had a common goal, a shared purpose. And so they didn't look at each other as liberals and conservatives. They looked at each other as fellow Americans. The second thing is that many of the legislators lived in D.C., and so they were able to build, to buy homes, and in this case, back then, because it was mostly men, their wives got together. There were things that brought people together, and then that spilled over into legislation. And then finally, the one that I think is the most important is that there were factions within the parties. The parties weren't monolithic. There were different groups within the parties that all spoke, that forced, of course, cooperation within the parties, but it also meant that if they couldn't get something within the party, they could go to a faction in the other party to see if something could be worked out. And so you had a lot of cross-partisan initiatives happening because there were these institutions, these middle ways that allowed for people to come together and talk. If you don't have any of that, it's going to be really hard to be bipartisan. The final thing that we need, and sometimes I think that this one is the most important of all of them, is that we need as a people to invest in our institutions. And this is not as hard as you think it is. I recently, as many of you know, I'm the pastor of a congregation here in the Twin Cities. It's a pretty small congregation. Some would say its future, I don't know if it's cloudy, and we want to kind of turn it around. And so I was reading something by Frederica Matthews Green, who was a religion writer. She wrote something a while back about, basically geared to people who are visiting and looking for new church homes, that if you visit a dying church, that maybe you want to stay and invest in it. That maybe instead of looking at the church, seeing that it not meet your needs and walk on, that maybe you spend some time there and see what you can do to help it to be a better place. Maybe that you come and pray for the people who make up the church. Maybe that you actually get a directory and pray over each person. What she was getting at is that if you want to see strong institutions, we have a role to play. In fact, it's a role we have to play. And for that to happen, you have to spend time. And I don't know how many people will complain about the political parties and how bad they are, especially on my side of the aisle, but they don't do anything. They don't spend time trying to rebuild it. In essence, we've become a nation of consumers instead of citizens. And so we want things that will work in the way that we want them to work in order that they meet our needs, instead of finding out how we can use our talents and our skills to build up those institutions. And so we don't have any sense anymore of responsibility to institutions, whether they're churches or political parties or civic associations. If we don't like the state of our current political culture, then maybe we should take part in political parties and try to change them, to force them to come up with other ideas. If we don't like the state of our organizations, civic organizations like the Elks or something, again, it's about volunteering and taking part. We have to stop considering being just customers that aren't pleased with how things turn out, and actually to be citizens that are interested in creating and making a more healthy and whole America. So those are the four things that I have to share about how we can rebuild America. And there are lots more. That's not the only ones that I have. But I think what I'm trying to get at is that America is broken, but all isn't lost. There is still hope. But we have to really realize that hope isn't in a person, it isn't in a group, it is in us. That was the system that we have operated under for centuries. And that the only way that things will change is when we are willing to step up and to be the change. And maybe if it's just us, little by little things will change. So if we step up and someone else down the street steps up, and if that other person steps up, things will happen and things will change. But it only happens if we're willing to take those chances, willing to take an active part in our society to bring about and foster change. Because you can only rebuild a society if people are willing to take the time to rebuild. Things won't change by themselves. We can't wait that someone else will do the hard work for us. If we want to see a society where there is liberty and justice for all, we also have to be a society that believes that together we must provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So I wanted to give one quick shout out about Juneteenth. I'm recording this on June 19th, which is Juneteenth, and this is the first holiday when it is a national federal holiday. I think that that's important. It's interesting that there has been, of course, some pushback, of course, from the same usual people about this. There's been some talk that somehow this will take away from July 4th. But the reality is, Juneteenth isn't taking away from July 4th. I think it fulfills July 4th. This isn't a holiday simply for African Americans. It's not simply a holiday for the woke. It's a holiday for America. It signifies our country at least trying to put to end a dark blot of slavery and to try to live up to those words that we find in the Declaration of Independence and also the Constitution, of equality, of the fact that America is for all of us. No, we're not necessarily perfect. We haven't yet banished every form of inequality. But Juneteenth signified that we moved forward, that we were willing to try to better live out who we are as Americans. The 4th of July, of course, is one of my favorite holidays because, of course, again, because of all the values that it represents. Juneteenth doesn't take away from that. It actually makes it more real. Of course, it's more personal for me as an African American who has obviously relatives, if you go far back enough, that were slaves. And so the fact that this symbolizes their freedom matters. But it isn't a holiday just for African Americans. It is a holiday for all of us. And it's also a way to spur us on so that we can be a nation that can truly live up to those words that are found in the Pledge of Allegiance. That we can be a nation that is indivisible, with liberty, and with justice for all. America, in many ways, is always a work in progress. We have never really been someone that comes out all perfect. And in some ways, I think that's good. Because no nation is perfect. No nation is complete. We are always working towards being better, being more whole, to truly be that city on a shining hill. We're not totally there yet, but we're close. And the fact that this holiday is now a holiday for everyone brings us one step closer. With that, I conclude this episode of En Route. Thank you for listening. Again, if you are, please go to our website, enroutepodcast.org. There you can either listen. You can listen to the podcast on our website, but even better, click on one of the subscribe buttons to the different services, whether it's iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, excuse me, Google Podcasts, or RSS, and subscribe so that you won't miss a show. And also, please consider leaving a rating if you find this show has been valuable. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a message. Again, you can do that at our website. My name is Dennis Sanders. I hope that you enjoyed this episode of En Route, where we talk about life along the way. My name is Dennis Sanders. Take care and Godspeed.